conducted evaluation of 125 centrally sponsored schemes in different sectors, and one of the important sectors included urban. The evaluation of the urban sector particularly covered 5 flagship schemes of MoHUA, which included Smart City, Atal Mission for Rejuvenation and Transformation, Amrit, Awas Yojana Urban, Livelihood Mission, and Swachh Bharat Mission, as you all know. But the important thing is we went ahead systematically, and the evaluation involved world acknowledged RACI framework, that is relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, sustainability, and impact, the RACI framework. In addition, we also looked at various cross-cutting themes, including use of information technology, climate change, gender mainstreaming, employment generation, among others. So, and we followed a mixed method using both qualitative and quantitative. But interesting from today's perspective is that we also did top-down sector work and bottom-up scheme work. So it has led to some very significant sector knowledge updation. As you know, from time to time, there have been important summarization of urban sector. So probably the last one was when high-powered committee sat down for urban review. So today, I think through this exercise, there was a quick relook at the sector, which we are going to present today. So as a part of this exercise, we also looked at best practices, and those best practices have already been shared with all the state governments through CEO Niti Aayog through Chief Secretary's office. We are also going to upload them. We are also going to share the sector analytical work also with the state governments. And today we have other esteemed panelists with us. From this evaluation was done by DMEO in collaboration partnership with Ernst and Young. So we have Srinivas Kauligi from who is an erstwhile partner of EY, along with his colleague Chaitanya. So both of them would be summarizing through a short 30 minutes presentation about the sector issues and so forth. Following which we will have an open session where the panelists would also give their comments. Following which we will have question and answer session where we would like to get feedback, comments, as well as suggestions from our esteemed participants. So with this, we are still waiting for a few other panelists to join, but I will introduce them. We are expecting Shri Kunal Kumar, Joint Secretary, Smart Cities from MoHUA to join us. And we also have colleagues. We are very happy to have Dr. Shami Rajneesh to represent state perspective along with other members from Government of Karnataka. But we also have colleagues from Tamil Nadu Slum Clearance Board, Mr. R. Setupati and Ms. Manimekhalai. Setupati ji is Chief Engineer, and Manimekhalai is the Senior Planner there. So with this brief opening remarks, I just once again, emphasize that this is a forum for knowledge sharing. We have some knowledge that has been generated through this evaluation, but this is first few of these exercises. But definitely, we are looking forward to taking this platform forward, where knowledge from different sources which are relevant to improve urban agriculture and other sectors is transferred as quickly as possible so that all the stakeholders benefit through this exercise. I once again would like to thank you all, and with this I request Venu to take this workshop forward. Venu, back to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for that opening remarks. While we also have now Dr. Ajay Sharma, Secretary, Punjab Government, also joining us in the panel. Without much further ado, I'll request Srinivas to begin the presentation, and hopefully we will hear from these esteemed panelists after we have done with the presentation by Srinivas Kogli. Srinivas, over to you.
Thank you, Venu, and thank you to Niti Aayog and all the other participants for giving us the opportunity. So we'll try and keep the presentation short, and without much further ado, Venu, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, I can see the screen and I can hear you perfectly clear.
Okay, thank you. So this presentation, we would like to share our broad observations and conclusions from the urban sector evaluation, and to just uh, context of the overall five flagship schemes assessment that was done. But today's focus would significantly be on the overall sector analysis and what important issues it throws up, what directions we can take for the sector as a whole, and certain suggestions that the study gives in terms of what can be done when we look at the sector as a whole. So as Dr. Bonu mentioned, these five flagship schemes collectively very significant programs, all of them fairly large schemes of the government, but and significantly impacting the overall urban sector. The analysis was done through both at the sector level and at the scheme level. At the scheme level, it was combining secondary research and primary research. There was could catch do a fair amount of field work in the between the wave one and wave two, and therefore conclude the primary part of the survey. Just triangulated with secondary research and sector analysis, which is the focus of today's presentation. We looked at how what has been the major transitions in the sector over the 5-year period, 2015 to.
Srini, can you be closer to the mic and be a little louder? I think we just
Yes,
probably have
I'll
yeah,
hold the mic
yeah,
closer to me. That's better.
yeah. Now it's better.
Okay. So to analyze the sector, we examined through the lens of livability, and we looked at what are the key outcomes, and from that tried to overall conclude the study. So uh, just as a context, these five flagship programs took off from the 10-year period of JNNURM, and these five programs in a way significantly marked a forward movement of how urban programs were, what they were targeting, and how they were set out to achieve that goal. So one is we had uh, five separate missions, three of them with universal goals: universal goal for water supply, universal goal for housing, universal goal for toilet access. And schemes like the smart city mission looked at the urban context with its full complexity, with all the interplay of the various subsectors within, to try and develop a certain specific set of initiatives in a targeted area to achieve a very significant quality of life difference. Similarly, NULM targeted multiple dimensions of urban poverty, and again tried to deal with the complexity around urban poverty. The significant aspect of all these missions, across all these missions, was the use of technology. One at the level of program management of the mission itself, and the second is embedding it within the programs too. Of course, there were some dedicated structures set up for these. The community participation was adopted in a few of these, and all of these I'm speaking in relation to the earlier missions. And competition and challenge were introduced in some of the missions, so it was not entirely based on entitlement, so to say. Uh, Other significant thing was that there were many new elements of the urban sector that came in, which hitherto were not so significantly part of the urban management mandate, whether it is in the realm of safety, security, or mobility, and so on. So today, as we look at the sector as a whole, to have examined it from the lens of what are the parameters that contribute to livability. Broadly, these areas under the four pillars do also align with the ease of living which the ministry has brought out, and ministry has been constantly improvising on it. Of living index for urban areas. So we'll quickly go into each of these pillars and then look at what issues are for us. So starting with infrastructure services, in terms of housing and shelter, we see that the 5-year period, with the emphasis of PMAY, there was a slight forward movement with respect to the extent of ownership, more so with respect to the quality of housing. So there is still a significant gap to be covered, and as we dive deep into the scheme, the land management issues were some of the major issues that came up.
Srini, I think you can have to come closer to the mic again. Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So related, one of the critical areas relating to housing. Of or even mid-sized cities than many of the city states like Singapore or Hong Kong. And our build densities, as you see in the table below, is very low as compared to what is there for cities of similar scale and size. This problem is further linked to the aspect of mobility. The last 5 years, we've seen significant ramp up in the metro connectivity, mass rapid transit connectivity, but on the bus connectivity, which is what we need for either last mile or in our mid and smaller size cities, the bus per capita is very low as compared to many of the other even middle income or other Asian countries. So traffic congestion with private vehicle usage is a glaring problem for us. So we need to see these issues. The reason we're just the extent of public spaces and availability for housing linked to compactness and density and mobility. Moving to the next area of management and environmental services. Water supply, again, the leaders more with regard to access to drinking water. Treatment remains the area of concern, whether it is the raw water treatment or even treatment. The raw water itself, the resilience of cities to clean water and the stress that we are facing with respect to water is something that has become very acute. These issues that now in the 2.0 Jal mission, etc., these are coming to focus. These need urgent attention. In wastewater management space, again, there's we move forward with the significant with respect to people and treatment capacity. Still, there's a large gap that needs to be addressed, and the potential for treating wastewater is significantly exploited. A significant part of the drinking water demand and industrial demand can actually be met through treatment of wastewater. So that's very capital intensive, and that's required significant focus of how the fund should mobilize for the same. The solid waste management is the collection in 98% of the missions like and to some extent the smart city mission have helped identify this and kind of generate a certain level of consciousness to create a deep down. But this is another area where a significant amount of work is needed. Moving to the fourth pillar of governance, which very significantly impacts quality of life. Citizen participation, the, uh, in this area, what we see is that the formal structures which are there have not significantly been strengthened. There is water quality or area subject. However, the mission have begun a set of engagement mechanisms which is appropriate to the mission, whether it is a smart city advisory forum, town meeting committee. So, no set of mechanisms have been put in place, while the legacy mechanisms that are the overarching with respect to the mandate have been not been strengthened. So, this is a important aspect to be done as we look at changing programs and existing missions or design of future missions, or what are we going to set up mission specific participation mechanisms, or how are we going to change the legacy mechanisms to just are by statute recognized. In the realm of capacity building, again, we find that while there have been quite a few capacity building exercises, again, most of them have been in the realm and context of the missions only. So the capacity building exercises have been held to better implement the missions with that focus, and building across the board capacity is an area which has not had adequate amount of focus, and we will talk about that as we go forward. In the realm of technology, significant strides have been made in terms of the use of data, especially in the last 5 years, in the way urban programs have been managed. Also, how data is pulled together either at the national level in terms of how the program is managed, use of geotagging, use of online portals, mobile apps, all of this has been quite mainstream into program implementation. At the same time, through the Smart City Mission and number of schemes, use of technology in the cities has kind of got a leg up and started moving forward. There's a lot that the ministry has taken up as lessons learned from the Smart City Mission, which are more current, recently triggered initiatives. Looking at financial sustainability, here there are some very important trends. We see that the central expenditure in urban sector has become a much larger share of what it was rural versus urban mix. Over 4 lakh crores of central expenditure has been incurred, on which, while these 5 missions are fairly large ones, but the centrally sponsored schemes account for 20%. The extra budgetary resources mobilized is about 42%. Fiscal Finance Commission transfers are about 18%, and other debt and other resources mobilized by the central institutions like HUDCO, etc., is another 20%. So what it implies is that there is a very significant share of funding which is there even outside of the sponsored, centrally sponsored schemes. Uh, uh, but when we look at the state level, when we come down to the state level, the situation gets a little bit more worrisome. We see that this we've taken out all the overlaps, and we've done the fairly elaborate exercise to see that in this at the state level, uh, if we account for the state share and the central share of the centrally sponsored schemes, that typically accounts for between 60 to 80% of the state urban development department's budget. What this implies is that the fiscal space left for a state government to do capital expenditure outside of the state budgets, outside of the centrally sponsored scheme, sorry, is much less. It's less than, definitely less than half. So a large part of the state fiscal space that is there for capital expenditure is going towards complementary funding of the central schemes, and therefore, in terms of areas that need to be taken outside the centrally sponsored schemes are not adequately getting addressed. When we look at the city level, municipal revenue scenarios have continued to remain quite grim. The municipal taxes are just 0.3% of GDP, whereas even in other middle income countries, it's around 1%. So that's basically municipal taxes are just less than 1/3 of the total municipal revenues, which typically should at least be half. That's what the broad even benchmark we can, if we benchmark ourselves with countries like Brazil and South Africa, etc. And there's an increased dependence on intergovernment transfers. So lack of adequate resource mobilization at the municipal level capex at the state level getting crowded out by centrally sponsored schemes. All this is kind of squeezing the fiscal space that is there. In this context, if you look at market borrowing from the perspective of capital expenditure, again, there's been very little progress in the last few years. While credit ratings were done on 223 cities, 153 standard withdrawn, and a small number of them, really 95 only of them, were really investment grade. So we will discuss this role of debt and why this is getting so critical, even in the context of how we look at the overall funding pattern for the central schemes. So while this is the kind of broad trend of this urban sector, across the various missions, we came across a number of good practices. Nitya has circulated these, but we thought it important to just mention a few. And these span across the various 5 flagship schemes. And right from whether it is in execution, whether it's in skill development, like the one in Jharkhand, which was used for housing, or whether it is in terms of urban planning, like Gujarat, or uh, how complementary schemes have been brought about by the states that build on, which leverage the state level implementation mechanisms to expand access to the same mission objectives to the towns not covered under, say, like Amrit. So we find a number of good examples. Indore, of course, what it has done in waste management has become quite legendary, and they've been winning awards consecutive years. Uh, in areas like which were not significantly focused on, like identity and culture, what Rajasthan has done in Jaipur in terms of adaptive reuse of heritage buildings are good examples to emulate. Karnataka's work with respect to how the state level nodal agency played a very active role in supporting the ULBs in implementation, while letting the cities themselves drive Amrit and smart city projects, but providing a good layer of backup support is something which multi ULB states can do well to emulate. Uh, Many states have gone ahead to innovate further, like they set up a cloud-based platform for city operations center, so that beyond the smart cities, the other cities could also implement a kind of real-time operations management system. So there are a number of good practices that are there from across the country, which will replicate, when replicated, can actually scale up the impact and outcome of these schemes. We now move to the next, as we looked at all the schemes, what, how they did in terms of relevance and effectiveness, sustainability, there were certain common issues that were coming out across all of them. And that is what we thought we can kind of try and conclude this exercise with. One clearly was in terms of outcomes, defining clear outcomes and outcome targeting. We found that in many schemes, while the scheme design and even when the scheme was getting contextualized at the city level or the state level through mechanisms like the smart city plan or through the state action plan for improvement in Amrit, there was focus on thinking through the outcomes. But somewhere in the course of execution, the focus entirely shifted, whether it was a city, state, or central level, to tracking expenditure. So the outcome orientation is something more fundamental that needs to be brought in. And we will discuss why this is so critical and what it implies for future schemes. Uh, Second area is the financial leveraging. We looked at the resource gaps, and if we look at the extent to which the central resources are leveraged, there is a lot more that is desirable. And that's how we will be able to bridge the envelope. And third is capacities to implement. Whether it is the role at the state level, whether it is at the city level, whether it is better partnerships from across the ecosystem, uh, building capacities to implement. So these are the 3 key themes. We'll talk about specifics in each of these, what are the implications for us. Now, we had to examine how the sector was impacted through as intended by the schemes. So as we examined the sector in terms of the livability parameters, we mapped to what extent did the schemes intend to impact the outcomes of the sector. Now, and when we say sector, we mean each of the 16 areas of livability. So for each of these areas of livability, we defined a set of desired outcomes, as you see on the left bottom table, a set of desired outcomes, and these desired outcomes came from various documents, the SDGs and various other policy statements, etc. And from there looked at which of those outcomes were mapped or can be mapped against what the scheme intended to achieve. And we obviously looked at these also from the lens of access or adequacy or quality, etc. So we did what we was the strong alignment, moderate alignment, and weak alignment. That is, strong alignment of the scheme vis-a-vis the sector intended outcome is basically the directly those outcomes were targeted by the schemes. A moderate alignment was the schemes indirectly made an impact on those outcomes, but need not directly target it. And weak alignment is basically the schemes did not target those sectoral outcomes at all. So we had over 150 odd total set of outcomes across these 16 areas of livability. And when we made this, put this in this form of a pictorial representation, as you see on the right side, the green, yellow, red, became obvious that only about 40% of the sectoral outcomes were being targeted by the schemes. About 30 odd percent of the sectoral outcomes were indirectly being targeted, and 20-25% of the sectoral outcomes were not targeted at all. Now, what does this imply? This implies that the missions in themselves cannot cover all the outcomes that we want to achieve in the urban sector. We'll come back to this important inference. We also looked at which scheme targeted how many outcomes. So the smart city was given the nature of the scheme, where it attempted a large number of interventions, targeted over 48 outcomes, whereas a PMAY urban, which was very focused on housing for all, on provision of housing, targeted a much narrower set of outcomes. This too has an important question for us. Should our schemes, whether they are state level schemes or central level schemes, should they be targeting very specific universal access kind of outcomes, or should they be targeting a much broader set of outcomes that impact overall livability? And what are the trade-offs between the two? So this brought us to the two key questions, and we are not trying to singularly present a certain point of view here, but more trying to look at a framework through which a scheme design can try and balance these conflicting paradigms. Is that these conflicting paradigms are essentially whether the schemes should target a very specific set of livability outcomes or a specific set of universal service goals, or should the schemes be leave it a lot open to the city and let the city prioritize what they want and let the city achieve a much broader set of goals, though they might achieve much less in terms of coverage or effectiveness. So these are the kind of two key issues that come before us, and if it is to be uh, defined as a broader set of goals or a narrow set of goals, who will define those? How will they be monitored? uh, and who will do the resource allocation across these. So these are issues that come up, and therefore these have very significant implications in terms of future program design, whether it is a centrally sponsored scheme or a state scheme. But needless to say, whichever approach is taken, the need to define outcomes as different from outputs is something that very strongly comes out as we went deep into each of the programs. I'll come to the next issue, which is a sector-wide issue on financing. Now, uh, in terms of the capital investment required for this sector, as Dr. Bonu mentioned, in 2011-12, there was the report of the high-powered empowered committee, which recommended an investment requirement of 39 lakh crore from over the 20-year period, from 11-12 till 31-32. So we took that as the base to see to what extent has investments gone into the sector. So we took the reference period 2012 to 18 based on what was available and what was the period we could have. So it was not exactly overlapping with the evaluation period of 2015 to 2020, but over this 6-year period, the investment requirement as estimated by HPC was 8.5 lakh crore, but the actual investment made in the urban sector was about 4.7 lakh crore. Now the left bottom column graph shows us how we estimated this actual investment made. which was a combination, which was various secondary sources, essentially, that was studied. A few state government budgets were studied, but it's a combination of what was spent finally through municipalities to what was done direct by state departments and direct by national governments in some central, through central PSUs or through the metro lines and so on, and what was done through PPP. So this was taken as the aggregate. If we look at this trend over the period of 12-13 to 2017-18, we see that the yellow, this is the left top graph that I'm referring to. The yellow columns are the investment as recommended by HPC, and the gray ones are what actually took place. What is worrying is that the gap that was there between this has increased from about 25% of the gap to 51% of the gap. The point is that the investment requirement, despite the fact that all these missions have been large, fairly wide encompassing, have pumped in significant amounts of money and are pushing further capital expenditure to happen, vis-a-vis the requirement, the gap still remains very significant. And this, when taken in the context of the fact that if you look at ULB finances, their revenue expenditures are around 98% of total revenues. So that means virtually entire own revenues is going only towards revenue expenditure. The cities have again very little fiscal leeway to incur capital expenditure from their own money. The revenue expenditures were more than the operating or than the own sources of revenue since 6-7. So the more recent trend within this trend is even more worrying. And out of the total expenditure, 60% was total was revenue expenditure. So again, much lesser capital expenditure being incurred. So this whole squeezing out of fiscal space really is something that what is the implication for this in terms of investment for urban infrastructure. Now, the other important observation we had was when we look at what the money got applied for in various programs and schemes. Now, and what typically in an urban infrastructure sector, the left side graphic that you see is the kind of projects and the kind of funding sources that should be there for those. So typically for projects that have commercial infrastructure, the capital investment should come from commercial real estate and transit oriented development kind of, which is basically land valuation based methods. For projects that have a kind of public utility but have revenue models, there could be some direct market borrowing. At the bottommost, basic civic amenities like parks, streetlights, roads, drains, etc., should typically be provided from local budgets because they're not very capital intensive. And the large multi-year investments which we need in water, wastewater, all the network infrastructure should really, this is where we have an economic internal rate of return, but not necessarily a financial rate of return. This is where we need multi-year investments. Now, the worrying thing we saw is that in many cities that, grant money, which could have been better leveraged, was actually used for providing basic infrastructure, which should have been ideally done through local budgets. So what the money gets, that leaves out that opportunity to leverage, and therefore the multi-year large investments that are required in network infrastructure remain stunted and limited. And that's why the widening infrastructure gap that we see. So this we would strongly suggest the need for a very rational policy response on how the intergovernment fiscal flows and the revenue base for a city is used across various types of urban infrastructure. And this would require state intervention, state policies, etc., to enable this. And most importantly, state level financial intermediaries to actually support smaller and mid-sized cities in having this leverage. So that from this is what emerges our most important point on the overall basis with regard to the need for leverage, without which we will never be able to bridge this widening gap. The third is in the realm of capacity building. Now, while at the mission level and otherwise there have been capacity building measures, I think what this urban sector is crying out for is capacity building measures that can be delivered at speed and scale. It's not enough to say we conducted 20 workshops and trained 2,000 people. The question is the target audience or the target group is probably 20,000 or for 50,000 people. So therefore, we need initiatives that can be at very large speed and scale. We need national level institutions that can support and deliver this and help and activate the ecosystem to be able to take this on. Human resource management issues, whether it's in the cadre or other mobility of urban sector officials, mobility across municipal bodies, all these issues. So human resource management issues are also something which is very critical. And current focus of limiting capacity building programs largely, which as they relate to the mission, is grossly inadequate. We need to look at it to make it far more demand responsive and what the needs of the cities are, not just for investment, but also for operations. The ecosystem issues with respect to emergence of new entities like the smart city SPV or clarity in functional jurisdiction. These are enablers which are very much required, and they will the more clarity that is quickly brought in at the state level within this, that will drive capacities much faster and sustain them. The last slide we have is therefore in the realm of capacity building in a very summarized way. What needs to be worked on is both policy plans, institution, and instruments. It is time that we looked at an urban sector skills council. There is a need for skills and not just knowledge in the urban sector, and these skills both within the government and even the private sector realm of service providers and contractors, etc. There are a whole range of skills which are very typical to the urban sector, which do not get addressed by other sector skill councils like construction or other relevant areas. The restructuring of the National Institute of Urban Affairs is something that the process that has begun. These are institutions that will need to take on these challenges and create a large grid of institutions that are support at state and city levels. What we therefore broadly talk about are these 5 areas. We need to build a much larger scale of higher learning in urban. The urban sector has got more complex. There are various sub-disciplines within them which require building a niche set of capabilities and specializations. We need to find ways to achieve much greater integration with global knowledge and professionals. Just looking at international examples is not good enough. We need to find a way by which we can blend in and bring in international professionals to be part of evolving solutions within India. Skill development is something I've emphasized for, and ways by which cities can bring in lateral talent. The SPV was one experiment in this effort, but that's something that needs further acceleration in terms of how lateral talent is brought into helping manage our cities. So broadly, to conclude, the 3 big areas the conclusions emerge from is greater focus on outcomes and better targeting of outcomes, a good balance between a broader to a narrower set of outcomes in scheme design. Second area is financial leveraging, ensuring that the grant money, the scarce grant resources that are there are used as much as possible to leverage and overall increase the capital investment available pool. And the third is building sector capacity in deep and wide. So with this, we will conclude the presentation, and making our cities work better, building better working cities is what will be critical for our economic aspirations as a country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Srinivas, for very enriching presentation, and thank you so much also for sparing time from your busy schedule to come and make this presentation. So we will now move to our panel discussion. We have very rich panelists and coming from different levels. First, I would like to invite Sri Kunal Kumar, who is the Joint Secretary, Smart City Mission, MoHUA, who heads the India's Smart City Mission and has played a pivotal role in transforming urban landscape of India. He has masters from IIT, bachelor's from IIT, and also a master's program from Harvard Kennedy School. And interestingly, he has been one of the very successful commissioners of Pune. He brings all the different perspectives. So, floor is yours, Kunal.
Sekhar, you were very generous. Thank you so much. And it was indeed an overwhelming presentation by Srini, because he has in a presentation kind of covered everything that's under the sun, whether it's finance or planning or infrastructure. So hats off to his presentation. I would be very brief. I'll try to be very brief. Of course, a presentation like that evokes many thoughts, and it makes you think, and makes you speak even more. But I'll control my impulse to speak, and I'll focus on certain very small points. I'll just share a slide deck. I'll just do it quickly. Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
Please make it full screen. Yeah, please make it full screen. Yeah.
When I make it full screen, in a couple of presentations in the past, it's not worked. So can I continue on this one?
Yeah, please go. Please go ahead. I think it's very visible. Please go ahead.
So urban is a state subject. Let's not forget that, very big, important point in today's discussion. And it's kind of, the discussion starts, is hovered around, it's made around the centrally sponsored schemes. But we have not to forget, we should not miss the woods for the trees. These are trees, but the woods clearly belong to the states. And if I have to really sum up four very important milestones in the urban journey of a country, of course, the Constitution itself, and then the 1988 National Commission on Urbanization, which I list here because it was the first time that a thought on urbanization and the commission required for urbanization was thought about. And then, of course, the 74th Constitutional Amendment, where the third tier came into existence. And 2005 I list because it redefined the urban fiscal transfer regime. Before and after has been very different. So why is urban important? All of us know, and in fact, a very clear correlation across the world. Where you see the cell range coming, that is India. In fact, it's not somehow getting represented here. Some issue with my software. So what it's showing is that more urban countries are more developed economically, and vice versa. And there are many ways of looking at it, but you see the same trend in India. And I mean, again, the software, I made the presentation. I hope I had someone like Srini to help me out here. But so if you see, the point I was trying to make is, even in India, you see the states are showing the same kind of correlation between economic growth and urbanization. The more urbanized states are more economically developed and so on. Now, economic growth actually does not happen only because of urbanization. I mean, theoretically, we can have the entire state urbanized overnight by declaring every village as a town. But there are certain nuances to it, decisions that have to be taken, policies that have to be undertaken, and essentially supporting a state's move towards structural transformation of its economy from agriculture to industry to services, which is what leads to urbanization. And therefore, this whole business of making our urbanization work for economic growth actually requires adaptive leadership. And adaptive leadership just cannot happen without greater degree of autonomy, transparency, and accountability. If I, as an individual, have to, have an aspiration which is much higher than my current state of affairs, then I need a lot of degree of autonomy to be able to achieve it. Otherwise, I would prevent myself from having a very high aspiration, because I know I will never be able to achieve it because I don't have those degrees of freedom. And here is a reality check on the consequences of the 74th Amendment. It was essentially to provide for, and forget the verbose nature of the slide, I'll just narrate in a couple of sentences. What is coming out is, very few cities have actually got powers devolved. We're talking of autonomy because we're talking of that huge aspiration to support economic growth, to support livability, and we're talking of adaptive leadership, but we don't have control over our actions. None of our cities in the country have control over all the 18 subjects that were devolved as far as the 74th Amendment goes. 12 of the 21 cities have, authority to approve their budgets. 9 remaining cities have, where the state governments actually approve the budgets and so on. This was a recent study on 21 cities done by Praja. And a CAG report also done for Karnataka points out the same anomaly, where it says only 3 of the 18 urban functions were under the full jurisdiction of the ULBs. This is the CAG report. And the CAG report goes on to add, for ward committees, that it defeats the objective of facilitating community participation in local governance. The absence of community participation would adversely impact the prioritization of development works, not monitoring of execution of works and utilization and maintenance of assets created. This is the parastatal versus city versus ward committee debate, which is a larger debate than just doing infrastructure, but also about the quality of works, who prioritizes. As Srini was saying, there is a centrally sponsored scheme on water. Now, going forward, if the city has to prioritize something, if the city says, no, public transport is my priority, but what does the city mean? It's their neighborhoods, it's their communities, but how do they come in the picture? If these local governance, frameworks are not activated. So there is a huge gap in what 74th Amendment intended to do. Maybe it was not framed properly also, but it could have still it could have brought a lot of change on ground, but it's not happened because states have still been reluctant to sort of give that autonomy to cities in a larger manner than just a um, couple of subjects here and there. And this has actually resulted today in a situation where we see that 17% of our population live in slums. We are not able to figure out what do we do with them. 2/3 of our waste is processed, and still grappling with the other 1/3. Not 40% of people in our cities still don't have tap water. 16% of the required buses for public transport are available. More than 4/5 of the buses are not available, and less than half of the ULBs have some kind of master plans and focused spatial plans. There are very few who could do geospatial plans. Now, why has this emerged? And in fact, in our own system, there are exceptions. And for example, the case of Indore, and why I'm raising a case of Indore here is that coming first in a Swachh Sarvekshan is a 360-degree exercise. It requires planning, it requires consultation, it requires technology, it requires governance, it requires social engineering, it requires behavioral change. And in a way, this example proves that it requires adaptive leadership of taking on a challenge, then making a coalition to accept that challenge, then getting action started, building the coalition, engaging larger partners, taking more stakeholders on board, taking on more and more activities, refining every day, going to perfection, and then being able to reach where they are at the moment. Now, this is only Indore in Swachh Sarvekshan. What about Indore in other areas? And what about other cities in Swachh Sarvekshan and other cities in other areas? So the huge scale up required from just one city doing something exceptionally well to many other cities doing it. What is the reason that prevents our cities from being so aspirational? Why would a city manager not want to pursue the same targets like Indore pursued in Swachh Sarvekshan? Why doesn't a city say that 10 years down the line, we want to be the best city in the country, or 10 years down the line, we want to be the greenest city in the country, or 10 years down the line, we want to be the most livable city in the country? I think the fundamental problem is that our cities are caught in a situation where they're not able to aspire beyond a certain limited point of view. Is because they, just like I gave an example, if I have to really aspire to run in an Olympic, I cannot do that because I know I don't have the capacity to do that. And so why should I even aspire for that? So the question is, yes, I don't have capacity, but this entire framing, and that I completely disagree with Srini was saying, maybe to some extent I disagree with him, is that capacity building is required. I think the fundamental problem of capacity is the problem of autonomy. If a system or even a human being has more degrees of freedom to do something, he or she ends up learning how to do that thing better. Now, it's a chicken and egg problem. What we think is we should not devolve more powers to cities because they're not responsible, they don't know how to do things. On the contrary, it may be so that because they are not devolved powers to do things, they don't learn how to do those things, and therefore the capacity doesn't develop. So unless people are given autonomy, it's about a child whose parents may end up tying his shoelaces till he reaches class 12th. He will never learn how to tie his shoelaces himself. Very crude example. But I think autonomy is the question. Capacity is the second order problem, and we completely end up treating capacity as the first order problem, and we neglect the aspect of autonomy. I think what is going to give capacity to our cities is autonomy and not capacity itself. Because infusing capacity in a framework which doesn't have the wherewithal to run with itself and doesn't have the autonomy to take decisions is not going to work. If the tracks are not good, however good a train will be designed, it will not be able to run on it because the track is not able to support it. And therefore, the track is the structure. The structure of the urban governance system, where we need to have more powers devolved, both financial, administrative, legal, building, for example, taking decisions on new legal frameworks like solid waste management bylaws or maybe some other bylaws, taking decisions on land monetization, taking decisions on raising money from the market, taking decisions on hiring people from the market, taking decisions to leverage other sources of finance, build more partnerships, public-private partnerships. These degrees of freedom will have to be given to give more autonomy to raise capacity. So the capacity question is not a capacity question. For me, it is an autonomy question. And it's like this. It will not take us too far if we keep only fixing the pipes. Rather, what is needed is to fix the institutions that fix the pipes. And I think this is quite, quite understandable for all of us. And also the grant-based schemes that we talk about, it's good because we as the central government, and it's a very important component of the finances of the urban local bodies and the state governments, but they are clearly not the answer. In fact, they should be the last resort. If you see over the last 10 years, the municipal own sources of revenue and own sources of non-tax revenue have actually gone down, which shows that, somehow there is a feeling that grants are coming and therefore we should not, you know, uh, it's actually decreasing the appetite for innovation and finance in the local context. And if you see the data that I have on the right side, as percentage of per capita GDP, the total subnational debt that is there in India and the US are similar, which means the states in the US raise the same amount of debt as in India, which is around 15% per capita. But the big difference is in the US, most of this subnational debt is city debt or municipal debt, whereas in India, it is mostly state debt. Now, the argument I'm pointing here is there is an appetite at the state level to raise money from the market. It's not that we are not raising money from the market. It's just that our cities are not raising the money, our states are raising the money from the market. Now, how can we channelize this power that we have? How can we channelize this ability that we already possess and channelize this money to the urban sector? Because otherwise, what's happening is over dependence on grants is not only going to debilitate our aspirations, it's not really going to be used enough to solve the humongous problems that we face, whether it is in water supply, whether it is sanitation, roads, street lights, or maybe all other sectors of our work. Plus, the fundamental nature, municipal revenues themselves are under tremendous risk because of a lot of other issues. Now, the state governments also will have to see how reliable our transfers can become to the cities, how assured they can get this money, and basically then they will be able to plan capital investment and raise money from the market also. So what is needed actually is then a fundamental reimagination of how we look at local governance. It's not only about delivering water, it's not about delivering sanitation or some services or delivering birth and death certificates. It's about the life of citizens, it's about economic growth, it's about livability in the state, and that requires a much larger aspiration, and that larger aspiration has to be backed by much larger autonomy to deliver things. And that's a completely different way of looking at how urban governance is currently performed in states. So how do we move forward? In fact, one, admin, financial, legal autonomy to cities. The second point is what Shri was mentioning is about outcome orientation. We have to innovate the form to suit the function. If we have to reach water to the citizens, maybe the current structure with which we work is not functioning, and therefore we will have to innovate the structure to reach that function to its desired goal. Otherwise, the structure can become a limiting aspect and will never let the form, make the function successfully get completed. And that's why the outcome orientation really helps us look very clearly as to this is the function that is needed, and then we go on re-engineering or reverse engineering or maybe doing away with certain things at the back end so that we are able to clearly focus on the function that we have to perform. Now, this is something that we'll have to do because there's a huge amount of deficit in urban services. Then thrust on private participation in improving urban infrastructure. Now, uh, a lot of the debate and a lot of the discussions that we have is all about government money. There's hardly any private participation that happens. And there's a lot of scope of private participation which actually come out. And street lighting is an example, markets are an example, transport hubs are an example, vibrant urban spaces have been created by cities, a lot of public bicycle sharing systems and all. There are many, many, many places where public-private partnerships can happen. Again, the thrust being on autonomy because public-private partnerships require two strong partners at both sides who are able to engage with each other. If our cities are weak and their administrations are weak, they will not be able to engage in public-private partnerships, which will then again, create that the vicious cycle. Then redesigning the whole structure of urban finance, and I mean urban finance and not municipal finance, because urban finance is a wider gamut than municipal finance. Municipal finance is only limited to the municipality, but urban finance will also include your urban parastatals and other bodies who deal with urban. And even if our cities can't raise money from the market, our parastatals can, because they will be backed by the state, and therefore the state can leverage the parastatals to raise money which will be required to fix systems in the urban areas. No matter either that way or this way, we will have to see fundamentally how we can leverage money from the market. Because simply put, even if a rich person buys a car, he puts 20-30% of his own money and buys the car with 70% loan from the market. But here we are putting almost all our money. My own example from Pune, I had 200 crores on my debt because I had raised that money from the market. But for a 5,000 crore municipal corporation, 200 is nothing. I mean, so I had hardly any leverage. If I had actually used the wherewithal that I had and had leveraged money from the market, I could have actually been able to do probably 5 to 10,000 crores of capital work in Pune and completely transform the city in the next 5 to 10 years. Such opportunities exist with at least all the million plus population cities in the country. Of course, revamping planning and much more. So much more, of course, much more needs to be done. And fundamentally, there are 3-4 questions which we need to answer. Do we truly believe that in democracy at the local level? Because if we don't believe in that, we will never be able to let the prioritization happen at the city level. We'll never be able to give the autonomy that is required to transform our cities. Because fundamentally, the question of capacity or the question of infrastructure or the question of the future of our cities is dependent on that. Have we collectively at the state level thought about the vision for the future of our cities in the state? And have we thought about how our cities can become more sustainable? Sustainability is a much wider concept than just climate. And how do you build infrastructure that is sustainable? How do you build cities that are resilient? How do you build cities that are resilient to shocks? We've seen such a tremendous shock, such an extreme shock in the form of a pandemic hit us in the last couple of years. Which cities have been able to do better? What are the learnings that are there? Are there learnings that we can get which can actually help us design sustainable cities in the future? So is the state really fundamentally, the last argument I have to make is the state ready to bite the bullet? If we go as business as usual, I think we will have many of these conferences but we'll really not be able to make the dent that is required in the humongous gap that remains in the urban sector delivery. And the question is it ready to empower its cities to be able to do that? Because I'll actually go back to this slide, where fundamentally the issue at hand is if we are not able to fix the institutions that fix the pipes will keep breaking and we will keep fixing them, and that will be an endless exercise. But once we have fixed the institutions, we have given them the teeth to be able to deliver, and there is accountability at the local level, there is transparency at the local level, then I think we would have done tremendous justice to this entire sector. So these are just some thoughts. Look, these are just some thoughts for all of us to discuss, and these are definitely not written in stone. And I'm so glad to the Niti team to have given me this opportunity to share these thoughts. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kunal, for the wonderful presentation and interventions. You really drill down to the much more fundamental issues of devolution, financial autonomy to the cities, and also predictable cash flows which can be leveraged so that longer term investments are made which leads to economic growth which can also help in increasing revenues of the city and reducing the debt. So it's all about leverage and investing in future and taking to a different scale from where we are. Before I invite our next panelist, esteemed panelist, Sri Vikram Kapoor, I would also like to request all the participants to use the chat box to share their questions. Actually, this is a wonderful segue. You raised issues of institutions, Kunal, and also about states' role, and also leveraging finance. And in the last 30, 40 years of urban institutional development, I think what Tamil Nadu has done through Tamil Nadu Urban Infrastructure Financing Corporation or fund is quite stunning. And it's probably one of the best success stories in urban institution building in whole of South Asia. It's sad that that institutions we have not been able to replicate across rest of the country. And today we have Sri Vikram Kapoor, who is now Additional Chief Secretary, Government of Tamil Nadu. But in his previous avatar, he has done a lot of urban work and also led some of these institutions. So I request Sri Vikram Kapoorji to please come in. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Shekharji. First of all, I must confess, I am not ready with a presentation. Of course, I have something, but it will take a bit long, and I'm aware that we are under a time constraint. So what I'll do is I'll restrict my comments to what I heard, the lovely presentation given by both Mr. Srinivas and Kunal. I listened to it very intently. First of all, I must say that I think what comes out very clearly is that all these schemes that have been implemented over the years, post JNNURM especially, they have been really schemes which try to make a lot of difference to the various sectors, impacting urban life. But I fully endorse what Kunal has spoken, that we are not, at least in all these programs and all these missions, one thing that has been missing is that we've not tried to set the institutions correct. I think the fundamental problem of urban India is that we need to fix a broken institutional setup. It's very well known, practically in all our cities in the country, there is a huge multiplicity of agencies that impact on the lives of its citizens. And most of these programs, which Srinivas had spoken about, be it your right from JNNURM to Amrit to Smart City Mission to Swachh Bharat Mission, most of these, correct me if I'm wrong, are mostly aimed towards the urban local body. Whereas it's a fact that the urban local body has very limited functions despite the constitutional mandate. I think Kunal mentioned out of 18, most of the cities have not even done, at least half the functions have not been transferred to them. I've been a municipal commissioner, and I know for a fact that the most important function, which is city planning, is not in the control of the city government or the municipal body. These municipalities are just what they are, municipal civic bodies which provide certain limited functions, namely waste management, maintenance of roads, street lights, and the works. Most of the other aspects of governance are vested with one or the other state agency. So when Srinivas talked about outcomes, see, you put them very nicely into four different buckets, so to say. But whether it's infrastructure or the social infrastructure, housing, environment, or economy, a lot of these, if you notice, actually are in the domain of the state government and not with the local body. So whenever a new scheme comes up, let's say the Smart City Mission or the Amrit scheme, it makes me wonder, whom are we addressing it to? Is it to the state agencies or is it to the city? See, just to give an example, you talked about housing. I don't know about most other states, but in Tamil Nadu, housing is a function purely in the domain of the state government, either through the housing board or the slum clearance board. So even if you bring a scheme, which is aimed at kind of rehabilitation of slums, the civic body has a very limited role. Likewise, if you talk of transportation oriented programs, the transportation sector itself is under the control of both the central and the state governments, whether it's the metro or the railways or the highways or the transport corporations. There are very few cities who really, the city municipal councils have any control on outcomes related to these infrastructures, so to say. So when we are devising these schemes, we have to be very clear whom are we addressing. Just by putting a control room, which will look into aspects like transportation, traffic, security, safety, these are not within the mandate of the city municipal council. It is with the either the traffic police or the transportation agency or other agencies of the government. So it's very nice to have fancy control rooms with people sitting there watching their screens and some large screens and all. It may make good optics, but really, are you utilizing those for the intended purpose? That's one. So a lot of the time, these schemes, I think they are diffused and it's not going to the right agency, and there is no coordinated view anywhere within the city to see whether the desired outcomes are actually being attained through these schemes. Srinivas also spoke about funding. I've been a member of the HPEC, which came out with the report, and happy that still that report has some relevance. It's very frustrating to see that despite so many years, we are still struggling with low municipal own tax revenues. He mentioned 0.3% of the GDP alone is a very small number as against the normative 1% of GDP the world over. Why is it that we've not been able to raise this number? Is it because the local bodies do not have the power, or despite having power, they are not being permitted to raise these taxes? Maybe because it requires state approval and there is politics to that. And because they are not regularly raising their own tax revenues, therefore the market does not recognize the local bodies as an entity that can access capital markets and thereby leverage its funds to borrow from the market, which is also I would say compounded by the fact, which I think Kunal made this point excellently, that these huge grant schemes starting from JNNURM have actually elbowed out debt financing as an instrument for financing capital expenditure. This is a point repeatedly made, that if you're serious about trying to build the municipal bond market as exists in the US and some other countries, you have to consciously allocate space, fiscal space, to these bonds to debt financing. And the other issue is, I think he also mentioned about monetization. I think this was also in the HPEC report, that one of the ways of raising resources would be to unlock land values. How can you unlock land value and monetize it if you don't have control on the most important function in city governance, which is planning? Local bodies are unable to plan. It's vested with the development authorities, which are with the state government. So therefore, again, this question of raising finance by local bodies is a non-starter, because you've not equipped them with the tools and the powers. And finally, on the question of capacity building, Tamil Nadu has had a municipal cadre for very long, so has so many other states. But when we again say that the states need to move towards a municipal cadre, let's be aware of the fact that the moment you develop a dedicated municipal cadre, while it has certain advantages, no doubt, but it also brings in state control. So when Kunal says that you have to free up these cities from state control, you have to ask this question: if you're advocating for a state cadre, you are indirectly bringing in state control. At the same time, you imagine a situation where an engineer can be at the whims and fancies of any state official, be transferred from one local body to another. What is his accountability? Whom will he be loyal to? He will not be answerable or loyal to the local body, to the council, to the mayor. So therefore, let's pause and have a look. Is it more advantageous to have a dedicated municipal cadre under the state government, or would you like to follow a model which is followed by several cities across the world, which is to take experts, city managers from the market, pay them market salaries according to your, of course, ability to pay it, but at least they should be answerable to the mayor and the council. There is also an issue with regard to the weaker local bodies. The moment you have a common cadre, they are all governed by the same pay structure. So irrespective of the fact whether that engineer or the health officer is posted in tier A or a tier C city, their pay is fixed. And therefore, one of the reasons why a lot of these weaker local bodies pay through their nose and their revenue expenditure practically covers only salaries is because you have fixed pay scales for municipal staff, right from the municipal commissioner down to the last grade employee. So therefore, we need to see whether there's an alternate available where you have a market of city, not just managers, but employees at various categories, whether they can be directly recruited from the market, where institutions are there to actually create these kind of resources every year by giving them training in modern municipal practices. So I think this is an area which we need to look at rather than simply saying that we need to have, a state cadre. So these were my remarks. There's lots to speak about, but I'm aware that we are short on time. So I'll thank Mr. Shekhar for giving me this opportunity and stop at that.
Thank you so much, Sri Vikram Kapoorji. I know that I just saw you joining and requested you to come to the panel, given your very rich urban and other experiences. Really thank you and appreciate the perspective that you have provided from the state. I would try to give a try. Our next panelist is Ajay Sharma. He is the Principal Secretary, Government of Punjab. We are not really sure whether he's joining. If you are there, Sri Ajay Sharma, can you please unmute and speak? Okay, looks like there's some technical issue there. So we had a national perspective. We also had a state government perspective. We also have colleagues from Slum Clearance Board of Tamil Nadu joining us. So I would call upon Setupati ji and Mani Mekalai to briefly come in and provide your perspective from a state institution. Can you unmute yourself and speak?
Sorry. Good afternoon,
thank
sir.
You.
Thank you for inviting sister as a panelist. And myself and Setupati Chief Engineer are here. And we'll be highlighting on the HFA implementation sort of what is the benefits we have got through PMAY schemes and how much is the completion and the pending status. And I'll also share some of the state government initiatives done for the implementation of the PMAY projects here. So now I invite Setupati Chief Engineer to say a few words on affordable housing implementation in the state.
Good afternoon, sir. Myself Setupati. Actually, Tamil Nadu Slum Clearance Board is a nodal agency for implementing PMAY, and Slum Clearance Board is already we have been in the field for providing affordable housing for the economically weaker sections. In various schemes we have implemented, sir. Finance commissions and Ray, Genuram. Now we are concentrating on the PMAY, sir. PMA, we have got two verticals. One is affordable housing in partnership, that is multi-story houses, and another thing is individual. They themselves they construct if they have a piece of land. So in both the schemes, huge subsidy is given by the both central government and state government. In ASP schemes, central government is giving 1.5 lakh per unit, and state government we are providing 7 lakhs. The cost of the project unit will be around 13 to 14 lakhs in Chennai, and 11 lakhs in other than Chennai, sir. For beneficiary construction, individual houses, they have to construct minimum 300 square foot, and the cost will be around 4 to 4.5 lakhs. And the government is giving 2.1 lakh as subsidy, both the central and state, and balance amount will be meted from the beneficiary. And we have got the approval around 6 lakhs houses, and we have completed around 2.2 lakh houses, and almost 1/3, and another 2 lakh houses are under progress, and balance 2 lakh houses yet to be commenced, sir. and we have the vision, and we have the target to get approval of another minimum 8 lakhs houses to make our state slum free, sir. Not slum free. There won't be in urban population. We have calculated 16% is the economically weaker section of slum population. So by the time if we can complete 15 lakh houses, so Tamil Nadu will be like a slum-free state, and we are targeting on it. We are working on it, sir. And we have got approval around in AHP. We have got approval around 1.6 lakh houses, and BLC we have got approval around 4.5 lakhs, and yet to get around 8 lakhs houses, sir. So our motto is to provide houses for the economically weaker section. We can see smile the faces of the poor is our main motto, and our organization was originally formed by our former chief minister 50 years before. It is one of the pioneer organization. Slum Clean Board is a organization formated in whole India, first of its kind, and later it was taken into other states, sir. Then I'll hand
Thank
over to
you.
Madam.
Thank you. Thank you, Sethupathi. Ma'am, you want to say something?
Yes, so for some of the bottlenecks were there in clearing down this AHP schemes as well as the BLC schemes. So as a state initiative, we got exemption from the approval for BLC schemes, which is below 400 square feet houses. And we also, there is an, as per TNCDPR, there is an increase from minimum FSI of 1.5 to 2. So that's the minimum that is the minimum FSI, base FSI, they made it as 2. So that has helped us in achieving more number of affordable houses in state, and many of them have already also shifted their concept of, rather than going for high-rise building, they have come down for a higher, that is non-high-rise building with more density and achieving more FSI also. So that has facilitated to accommodate more number of houses, and it also encouraged the private sector to renovate their houses to achieve the excess FSI and give some more housing units for the affordable houses. So that also has helped us in increasing the housing units. And finally, I just would like to say, like we have achieved the Tamil Nadu affordable urban housing and habitat policy in the year 2020 with the help of World Bank. We have World Bank policy funding, as well as we are also implementing some of the ADB projects. So that has helped us to go for Tamil Nadu as a comprehensive policy of Tamil Nadu affordable urban housing and habitat policy. And we are also doing a lot of livelihood support for the beneficiaries through community development wing. We give women empowerment schemes, and also we are having family counseling centers and doing job training for the job youth in the communities and all. And I'd like to finally conclude with saying that we have also come out with the resilient urban design framework, which is there in our website also, with the guidance of World Bank, wherein we want to improve the designs of the housing designs for the affordable housing with some basic, it's also encouraged green building concept, and we will very clearly saying like what should be the how the site plan should be designed for it, and what are the aspects to be considered, and to strengthen the housing designs of the affordable houses. So this is the status of Tamil Nadu in the promoting affordable housing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, colleagues from Tamil Nadu Slum Clearance Board, Sri Sethupathi and Ms. Moneymaker Lai. So with this, I think we will conclude the panel session and now open up the question and answer session, for which I request my colleague Venu to coordinate. Venu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I think we've almost come to the close of the session, so I'll probably pick up very few questions and probably take up the other questions. Most of them are actually in the form of commentary. probably reflecting some of the questions that were some of the thoughts that are actually discussed by Srini and Kunal sir and also Vikram Kapoor sir, especially the questions on the capacity gaps and the need for autonomy, whether one comes after the other. It's a chicken and egg problem. I think it's not that we have to prioritize one another. I think these are two things that have to be prioritized and focused together. And then there was thoughts on especially the revenue capacities of the urban local bodies, given that we talked about, Kunal also talked about the reduced role of urban local bodies, given that and the 74th amendment talks about 18 functions to be devolved, but not all of them actually devolved, less than half of it has actually been given to the city governments. But even then, that a reduced role, the revenue capacities of the urban local bodies still are not sufficient to deliver to those functions which are being given to them. So I think this is one point which we clearly also highlighted in our evaluation report, where the financing gap clearly comes out as one predominant concern to to address the urban local bodies problems, and the current gaps over the years from the report of High Powered Economic Committee in 2008, this gap has been actually increasing. So I rather than I will probably say, reply to some of these questions, collect the thoughts from our panelists, and share it over email to the respective state nodal officers. With this, we almost come to the end of the session today. I would now request SP Srivastav, Director DMU, to give his vote of thanks. And yeah, over to you, sir. SP Srivastav, sir.
Thank you, Well. So, thank you all for joining this online webinar on insights from urban evaluation study. I would like to take this opportunity to individually thank each of the panelists, Shri Vikram Kapoor sir, Kunal sir, Sethupathi sir, Madam Manik Nike, Lai, Srinivas ji, and Chaitanya ji, who are here with us today for sparing their valuable time and sharing key insights on urban story. I would also like to thank our DG, Dr. Shekhar Ponu, for his constant guidance and support. DG sir is a strong proponent of cooperative and competitive federalism, and the webinar today is a result of sir's vision of strengthening capacities of state functionaries. I would also like to especially thank Principal Secretaries of Planning Department and Urban Department of state governments for their cooperation and support, and all the team members and monitoring and evaluation nodal officers from DES as well as district authorities from all the states and UTs who have joined here today. I hope that today's session would have been enriching for all of you. I would also like to mention that we have shared a compendium of best practices emerging from urban evaluation study with the state governments, and will also make them available on DMEO website soon. At last, let me thank my state matrix colleagues and entire DMEO team members who made this online webinar happen. Just to mention that this is the first in the series of webinar on sector presentation by DMEO. The next two webinars will be on agriculture and health sector, and we'll be sharing the details soon over mail. So thank you once again for joining this call today, and thanks to all for joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
ஆமா அவர்தான் பார்த்துட்டே இருக்காரு. நான் மியூட் பண்ணேன்.